This presentation is titled The Unified Model of Adjustment to Vision Loss, One Way to Measure Movement Through the Adjustment Process. I am John McMahon, and I have put this presentation together trying to fold in a lot of the information that we use every day when we are working with clients who are blind or visually impaired. In attempting to do so, I wanted to make sure that I could give you something that by the end of this presentation, you would be able to do two things. Number one, you'd be able to start using some of this material that really the next day. There's enough here that you'd be able to say, oh, I can start looking for these things. Number two, I've given you enough references that you can go into a much deeper dive because in 45 minutes, we're only scratching the surface. The whole idea of adjustment to blindness or adjustment to vision loss, just as with any other adjustment to loss, it's the cornerstone of everything we do. So in some university preparation programs in the blindness profession, the adjustment piece is an entire course. That's how important this is. So again, understanding that this is just a thumbnail sketch, it'll give you enough to really get thinking about this maybe a little bit differently. And one of the things is most people ask me a question, well, how do you know when somebody is moving through the stages of adjustment or the process of adjustment? Well, the unified model that we're going to talk about today has settled on some ways to do that. So that's what we're going to concentrate on. But we're really going to break this presentation down into three parts. The first part is we're going to spend a few minutes just laying a little bit of a foundation about how working with clients is so important, how we work with clients is so important. Then the second part is a pretty basic discussion of psychological defense mechanisms, because we really don't get into understanding how people move through the stages of adjustment if we don't have at least a cursory knowledge of the psychological defense mechanism. And then we'll get into the stages, the 5 stages that we're going to talk about near the end of this presentation. So there are like 4 major approaches to dealing with clients who are blind or experiencing vision loss, especially if they're new. So something to think about on this slide, I put the 4 ones that I have heard the most. So to help the consumer adjust to vision loss, what's the first thing that the blindness professional should do? And these are the 4 major sort of approaches. Get the consumer to acknowledge their vision loss. Help the consumer understand their eye condition. 3, build a trust relationship with the consumer. And 4, teach the consumer a skill where they can experience immediate success. And although all 4 of these things are critically important at some point in the process of working with a client for the professional, the absolute number one thing that we have got to do if we're going to provide the most successful rehabilitation program is build a trust relationship. The more our client can trust us, the more they will be willing to open up into some of the things that really are bothering them. It isn't, when we're working with clients, it isn't just that they may not be able to do something any longer, or they may be able to do it, but it's very difficult. It now will get into, if they trust us, it'll get into the things that may be embarrassing to them or humiliating. I go to a baseball game and I eat a hot dog and the mustard goes down my shirt. Do I know that if I can't see it? And if I don't know it and it's there, everybody else knows it. And then I find out when I get home, that can be pretty embarrassing, pretty humiliating. So some of those kind of things you might not find out until you build that trust relationship. So we're going to talk about that for just a second. So the psychological adjustment to disability, or more specifically, vision impairment, and some of these bullet statements on the slides I'm going to reiterate because I'm going to want to talk about them more. And other ones I'm just going to go right by because you have access to be able to look at them yourselves. So this has historically been looked at a process by which the individual passes through sequential stages. And this is true for loss as well. We know the stages of loss. Those became very famous, oh gosh, 50, 60 years ago by Kubler-Ross. And so we all have a pretty good idea of that. So historically, that's how it's been looked at. You start here, you move here, you move here, you move here. Well, the unified model continues with that, except that it isn't just one process of movement. As we'll get to later, you can move forward in the process, you can move backward, you can move forward again, you can move backward again. You can go from stage 2 to stage 4 and stage 4 to stage 1. So it is a little bit trickier than just getting on this nice, clean, cozy roadmap, as it were. And of course, the culmination of the adjustment process is to come to terms with the disability, or to come to terms with the vision loss, and to ultimately accept it as just another personal attribute. So this is a little bit of what Dean Tuttle writes about. And Dean Tuttle's book about adjustment is in the reference list, so is Father Carroll's. Dr. Tuttle and his wife, Dr. Tuttle, wrote a really good book. They wrote 2 of them actually about 10 years apart, and it really is worth everybody to have them. So with Father Carroll or Dean Tuttle, they really talk about rehabilitation as a change of mindset. And that's how we're going to look at it too. When we're successful in rehabilitation, by the end, we're going to have changed the mindset. So in the beginning, when we're thinking about loss and oh, how terrible, by the end, we're thinking, yeah, I'm just another blind guy. So I want to tell you a story that sort of proves this point. So I was familiar with a client years ago named Brad. And Brad used to be a real estate banker. He was incredibly successful. He had an eye condition that took his peripheral vision first and left his central vision intact. So he had vision loss going on far before it started to impact him. But eventually, he was no longer able to drive. He was having trouble at night, and he was all of a sudden thinking about, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job. And if I can't work, how am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to feed my family? And all these things that we hear when we work with clients. So, in talking with Brad, we had to go in and find out. We had to talk about those fears. We had to help him understand what was going on and try to convince him that we had some things that we could show him that would enable him to stay independent. And we had some different ways of thinking about things like driving that would still allow him to do this job if he wanted. Well, this young man wanted nothing to hear about it. He could not get past that. Oh my God, I'm blind. He was stuck right there. But you don't just give up on somebody, because we know that's where people get. They get stuck in that shock. So we kept showing up and we kept talking and we kept building that trust relationship, looking for some common ground. And over the course of time, maybe, gosh, it must have been 6 or 7 or 8 years, we found out that this young man loved music. He played guitar, he wrote poetry, loved the outdoors, hiking and all that, but his real love was fishing. Well, I didn't know anything about fishing other than, you get the big fish from the restaurant and they taste good and you eat them. So in finding out what's the issue about going fishing that he didn't think would enable him to be able to go fishing ever again as a blind guy. And he said, you know what? Tying the hooks. If I can't even tie the hooks, how can I possibly do anything else? So I kind of tucked that in my back pocket. And more meetings and more talk and gathering information and building that trust relationship. And over the course of time, finally got him to be okay with talking to somebody who couldn't see and went fishing all the time, went to Canada every year on a fishing trip. And I finally got him to agree to a phone conversation, just 10 seconds. I said, let's call him, ask him your question, and then we'll hang up. And so he finally agreed. And we're a good year into our program now, trying to find a way to engage him. And so he agreed to this phone conversation. That 10-second phone conversation turned into a 20-minute phone conversation because they hit it off, and the person that I had him called not only was a experienced fisherman, he was also a musician, played a banjo, and my client played guitar. So they had a lot to talk about. And all of a sudden, they're building common ground. By the end of the phone call, the gentleman says, well, look, we're just getting ready to go fishing to Canada. Come with me. And my client said, well, yeah, okay. And I to this day, I don't know what made him say, yeah, okay, but he went. So here's the aha moment. They're riding up to Canada. He's in the back of the van with this other guy who's a fisherman and a musician who's completely blind. So already my client is totally freaked out. He's never met a totally blind person before. In fact, he's the only person he's ever met himself who had a vision impairment. So they're in the back of the van, and my client's all freaked out. He's wondering, what in the heck have I done? So they start talking about, how do you tie your hook? And the fisherman, the experienced guy, said, well, let me show you. And he showed him in literally 1 minute how to tie his hook. And then they went on and in 5 minutes showed him how to tie flies. And my client said that's when the light bulb went on. And he goes, oh, I get it. I have to learn how to do things differently. That's the moment we're looking for. And so when we say rehabilitation is changing a mindset, that's the mindset. So when we think about it, the adjustment process, you never know what is going to be that piece that's going to move somebody forward. But that conversation would have never occurred if my client didn't trust me. He knew I wasn't going to wasn't pushing him off on somebody, wasn't washing my hands of him. It was really trying to get him the answer to a question. So it just shows the importance, that story with Brad, of building that trust relationship. It is essential. Because as a rehab professional, we're not just a service provider, but we're a rehab professional with a therapeutic purpose. That doesn't mean we're all therapeutic counselors, but that piece that we do, that talk, that finding out about them and working with them, that is adjustment counseling, small a and small c. We're not counselors. I'm a certified vision rehabilitation therapist. I am not a trained counselor, but I have provided so much adjustment counseling to clients over the years, hundreds and hundreds of them, because it's what we do. So to be most effective, rehab professionals must establish a person-centered trust relationship with consumers. So what this means is getting to know them, where they come from, what's the common ground, what are their favorite colors, favorite interests. As I said, where'd they come from? Where are they now? What do they dream about? They have any grandchildren? They have any children? Do they like sports? Do they like to play guitar? Do they like to go fishing? Finding that common ground. And the interesting thing is we don't have to be experts in the common ground. We just have to say, hey, there are some things. So with Brad, he liked playing guitar. I don't know how to play guitar. He liked to go fishing. I'm not a big fisherman, but those were things I knew people and I knew I could establish some common ground there. So learning and remembering these kinds of little bits of information greatly help to build that trust relationship. So it's important to understand that the quality of the therapeutic relationship that grows out of the trust relationship is the primary agent of growth in the consumer. It is the thing that allows them to do the work to make the changes. We provide instruction and alternative methods, but they have to do the work. They're more likely to do the work if they have a good trust relationship with us. And here's the other thing too. I say this a lot. We have to be careful to be teachers, instructors, not demonstrators. Our clients don't need us to go in and put bump dots on their wash machine dials, thermostat, and microwaves. They need us to teach them how to mark appliances so they can take control of that. And they don't need us to do it anymore once we teach them. That's part of that trust relationship. So it's more than just talking, it's starting to give them some of those skills. We also have to be a little bit careful of how we're coming across in that first meeting, because the more genuine the trust relationship, the more therapeutic it becomes. And if we go in there and we're not totally sincere and we're sort of trying to fake it until we can make it, the old saying, or we're pretending a little bit, that is easily felt by consumers and it feels a lot like pity. So it doesn't really help the trust relationship. So we really do have to be sincere in what we're doing. And for this, I look a lot at Carl Rogers. He wrote a lot of the seminal information on building a trust relationship and the real consumer-centered planning. So if the consumer feels safe and the therapeutic relationship is strong, then the desire to change can grow within the consumer. And that's where we want it to come from. We want it to come from them. Do these things that we're trying to get them to do because they want to be more independent, not because that's what they should do because we're there in their home or they've showed up at the rehab center. We're going to talk just very quickly now. We're going to go from that trust relationship because I could talk on that for hours, but we're going to go into the psychological defense mechanisms now. And in order to do that, we have to go back to Sigmund Freud. And we all know about the id, which is that primitive part of our psyche that drives us to get all of our basic needs met. This is food, water, shelter, safety. Everything else comes after that. If we can meet those needs, we're doing all right. The ego is the instinctive reaction to the id. So if our basic needs aren't met, our ego will react to that. And that's where psychological defense mechanisms come from. They are used as a way to protect us when we can't meet our basic needs or these needs are threatened. I put a slide in here of my Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because when you line up Freud and Maslow, you look at some of those basic levels. The lowest level, Maslow usually is viewed as a pyramid. I've got it on here as a table. And if you look at the lower two levels on that table, you'll see some of those same things: food, warmth, shelter, safety. These are the things that are basic needs. And if we can't meet them, then we start to form psychological defense mechanisms. Remember my story about Brad? He wasn't worried that he might fall down. He was worried that he was going to lose his job, lose his house. How is he going to pay his bills and feed his family? So it easily can be fit right into meeting these basic needs. So a psychological defense mechanism, easily defined, is a way to handle a threat against one of our abilities to meet our basic needs. So reactions to threats have a conscious and a subconscious component. The subconscious component reacts automatically to decrease the trauma associated with not meeting basic needs. So the key word in that whole sentence is trauma. When we experience trauma, automatically we start to develop and utilize psychological defense mechanisms. And they're in our subconscious, they're automatic. Behaviors that come from our conscious that we choose to do, those are logical and rational in most cases. Whereas behaviors that stem from our unconscious, where psychological defense mechanisms stem from, those are often irrational and illogical. And, they're abnormal. But they're there to help us function. They can appear to be nonsensical and even threatening. So psychological defense mechanisms are healing tools that naturally occur in humans and that protect us from the trauma posed by sudden, unexpected, and massively extensive events. Blindness would certainly qualify. Now think back to Brad. He didn't all of a sudden wake up one day blind. His was slow and slow and slow. But when it hit something that he could no longer do, I can't drive anymore, that's trauma. That's a massively extensive event at that point. We all get that when we think of things like death of a loved one, breakup of marriage, or onset of a general disability. But sometimes it's the thing the disability brings. Like in Brad's case, it was the loss of the ability to drive and the potential loss of his job. And again, the important thing here is the trauma. It's easy for us to forget that our clients, even if they're not newly blinded, are likely still dealing with the trauma of what's going on, what's happening in their world. Importance of identifying psychological defense mechanisms. Again, you want to try to be able to identify what psychological defense mechanism a client is using. Well, this presentation is going to, again, give you a thumbnail sketch. I would go read some more to get really good at this. And one of the reasons why it's important to know more about this, because if we don't, we may look at a person's behavior and mistakenly assign that behavior as their personality. And that could cause us to dislike that individual or to have our own subconscious psychological defense mechanism to the behavior that that person is exuding. So for instance, if you have somebody who's you go in and they're very angry and hostile, it's very easy to react negatively to that. It's also important to understand that confronting psychological defense mechanisms can quickly undermine the trust or therapeutic relationship that we have with clients. In a way, it can convey to the client that they're, just a case to us as a professional, like everybody else is. There's nothing unique about them, when what they really need is to understand they're incredibly unique. And it's the psychological defense mechanisms give us the basic ability to start measuring the process or the movement through the adjustment process. And sometimes this is the only way we can measure growth, especially as it relates to the beginning of the adjustment process. And then, of course, psychological defense mechanisms become detrimental if a person hangs on to them and uses them as a way to shield themselves from really integrating back into their life. If I'm going to be angry and hostile because I'm losing my vision, that's one thing to do that after 6 months. It's another thing to still be there 3, 4, 5 years later. So the psychological defense mechanisms common in early adjustment. First, we need to understand a few more things about them. They come and go throughout the process of adjustment. Strong ones typically come early, and less severe ones come typically later on as a person is moving through the process. So we know some of these strong psychological defense mechanisms. Denial would be one of those. So when somebody is in denial, they subconsciously ignore the very fact that a problem might exist or that it will be permanent. So for instance, the doctor might talk to you about, first they're going to say, you're now legally blind. So there's the trauma. But then they say, but there's this stem cell research, or there's this surgery that I heard about. And then all of a sudden a person kind of can get a little bit hopeful there. So that's a way of denying as well. And then withdrawal is another early strong defense mechanism. And the problem with this is a person can just take themselves away from human interaction and pull away. The typical phraseology here is caving. They just need to cave for a while. And again, it's a way to protect themselves. Regression is another one, a way of going back to a safer, easier place. Intellectualization is a interesting one, because when you're experiencing the trauma of vision loss, you're losing control all through your life. Think of Brad, losing his control to drive, losing his control to work, losing his control to feed his family. So what some people will do as a psychological defense mechanism is they'll read everything they can on their eye condition, and they'll become an expert on it. So that's what they'll talk to you about, is their eye condition. So a psychological defense mechanism can be positive or negative. Of course, they're positive when you're using them to adjust to the trauma, and they're negative if you hang on to them and you use them as a way to mask your self-esteem. And of course, psychological defense mechanisms can be greatly impacted about where your self-esteem and self-worth comes from. If you have a pretty good healthy dose of that's internal versus external, you may have an easier time with things, because if you're paying attention to how others think about you and what you think they think about you, then the prejudices that can be out there can greatly impact you. So I've given you a thumbnail sketch of some psychological defense mechanisms. We're going to now go into the 5 stages in Livna's unified model of adjustment and see where some of these psychological defense mechanisms play out. So there were 2 sort of main schools of thought through the years. One is that acceptance of blindness or acceptance of disability had to occur before instruction or rehabilitation would be accepted. We've all likely heard this. I hear it all the time when I go work with clients. Well, they're not very receptive because they aren't accepting of their blindness. Well, that just kind of makes sense to me. Why would you accept it right away? And if somebody did, we sort of might want to worry about that a little bit. And another way to look at this is that rehabilitation instruction or rehabilitation counseling is better approached after one's self-esteem has been totally reorganized and the client has accepted the loss. See, that's sort of the big part of they won't benefit from rehab until they've accepted it. Well, they can't really accept it until their entire belief about themselves gets reorganized and rebuilt. On the other side of this coin is the use of disability-specific rehabilitation, which then helps us promote acceptance. This is where you go in and you find a way to introduce a couple lessons that will quickly help somebody find success right away. This is great, except that if somebody is at the beginning of the adjustment process, they're not going to engage with you. So trying to fit in the middle there is really where we find the most success. So getting some successes early is important. Building that trust relationship is important, but using some successes that you can build on quickly. And as soon as you can help to build competence, you'll help to build confidence. That would be the writings of Dean Tuttle and Paul Poncilla. So anytime you see their names associated with the adjustment process, you're going to see that model. Well, what Livna did is looked at like 40 models, and he said there's some common threads through all 40 models of adjustment. He put them together into the unified model of adjustment, which brought us then these 5 stages. I just want to make one important point here, that even if somebody is reluctant, they're in the beginning process, you're in there to teach them, boy, and you want to get going, but they're not ready for that. You still have to find a way to engage them. And that is a real skill set, and it doesn't just happen. So if you're not very good at that, practicing with somebody is a really good idea. Because if you ignore the fact that they aren't very engaged, it will just prolong inaction and acceptance. One of the best quotes I ever saw related to this is, counseling is art and science masquerading as conversation. And again, by counseling, I'm not talking about the big C of counseling. I'm talking about what we do with our clients. It is that skill of going in and having a conversation that's allowing us to gather information and disseminate information without having to go in with a checklist and just be checking things off, because that doesn't help clients get through the adjustment process at all. So remember the whole story with Brad. That couldn't have happened without that art of conversation. A person can move through the stages at different times. Each stage can last minutes, hours, days, months, years. And you can move forward, then you can move backward. You can jump, as I said before, you can go from stage 2 jump up to stage 5 or what looks like stage 5, back down to stage 3. So it's not something that is something that you can measure quickly and easy. That's why you have to look for the patterns, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. One of the things that Livna notices that in stages 1, 2, nope, that's not right. 2, 3, 4, and 5, there are certain word phrases that he saw that were used a lot. And when those word phrases come in, that's how you are able to measure where the person is and how they're moving through the process. So it's not about a single sentence or two, it's about a whole pattern. Stage 1, initial impact. This stage is often not observed by us, by rehabilitation professionals, as people in this stage generally avoid interaction with others. And they are doing that because they are experienced that very basic initial trauma. They just heard they're going blind. The last thing that most people want to do at this point, or can do at this point, is talk about it. Sometimes they just have to breathe. So some of the signs in this stage that are a little more obvious is that the client enters a kind of trance characterized by numbness and inactivity, and that can progress to a substage of great anxiety or agitation. And essentially they're in shock. And if you've ever talked with anybody who's in shock, they're not overly communicative. They're just sort of there, existing. And it's, again, a way that your body protects itself. You have to be able to process that a little bit. Also in this stage, people tend to feel the total loss of control or the potential loss of control that they see coming down the road for them. And the world around them, at least in the short term, becomes pretty insignificant because I'm going blind. And at this point, we haven't started building psychological defense mechanisms because we're still experiencing the trauma. So this is a big one. A lot of times if we ever get called from somebody who's in the hospital, they've just been in an accident, they lost their vision, they're coming home, and can you be at their house right away? Well, typically at that point, they're not even starting to the adjustment process because they're still in that shock. Stage 2, defense mobilization. And again, you recognize this by behaviors and language. This is where denial kicks in, and this is where you will typically hear a client say, "No, I don't need you." Clients in this stage will, remember we talked about denial, they'll often talk about the cure or the hope that the disabling condition is going to get better, and they absolutely believe these things. The danger for us is that we look at that and we say, gosh, they're really doing well in this adjustment business. They're doing great. When in reality, that's just their defense mechanism for denial. They can seem real happy and everything, and we've got to be real careful not to think that they're adjusting well, when in reality, we're hearing, I don't need you. If you're getting a lot of I don't need yous and your client looks really happy, chances are they're just at the beginning and they've got a pretty healthy denial going on. So again, they're reluctant to participate at this point. How are you going to develop the skill to engage them at that point? That's that conversation. That's the talk. Because they don't want to work with you on what you want to work on, but you can still get them to talk. Again, remember Brad. And this is where that trust relationship is so important. And repression is a weaker form of denial, which allows the individual just to push the problem to the background and ignore it for a while. Stage 3, initial realization. So movement from denial to the initial realization stage is quite dramatic. It doesn't typically happen slow and easy. A person goes from real happy and encouraging and they look like they're doing well, and then they're not. The hopefulness of denial ceases and sadness and hopelessness arises. This we term the I can't stage. This is where you hear, I can't do it. I can't see, I can't do it. And I gave you some examples of pretty common I can'ts here. This reading one is a real common one because we have a lot of success with digital books, right? Well, here, let me show you the talking book program. Oh, I can't do that. I want to do that. I can't do it. That's not really reading. So you have another kind of reluctance. This person, again, does not want to work with you. How are you going to use that skill of talking and conversation to start building the trust relationship and find some doors to slowly open? And again, you just got to hang in there and keep trying with that until you find something that they're willing to take a look at. And it may happen in an hour, it may happen in 4 visits. One thing I was always taught, the goal of your first visit is with a client is to get a second visit. And you see some of the other ones here. Sometimes people just won't even communicate with you. That's a lonely place to be as a service provider because it's very difficult to find something to get them to talk about. So here's where you also see that substage termed internalized anger. And that's where you get anger based inward on, I caused this somehow, I sinned, I did this, I did that. And so you really start getting down on yourself. And this is very typically where suicidal language will come in. So again, the phrase here is I can't, and you don't just look for a person to say I can't once. It's just that overarching pattern phraseology that they're saying. Stage 4, retaliation and rebellion. So this is characterized by where the anger, instead of now being internal towards myself, I'm now going to put it out there, and it likely is going to be directed at you or the client's spouse or their family, or fill in the blank, the dog, that VR system, that blindness agency, they don't know what they're doing. So you get a lot of anger and hostility here. So the phraseology we hear most often here is I won't. So this is that sort of teenager, I won't do it and you can't make me. And again, oftentimes we can diffuse that hostility and anger by simply apologizing, sort of owning that, and then just trying to move on. But again, we got to continue to try to build that trust relationship. The more that the client will trust us, the quicker the movement through this phase will be. And here's where it's so important to acknowledge the issues they're going through and they're experiencing. We don't have to agree with those issues. We don't even have to know that they're right in what they're feeling, but those feelings are real for them. So we have to acknowledge them. And again, if you've built that trust relationship, here's where it really pays off. If you confront that hostility and that anger in that sort of combative way, you can destroy any trust that you've built. So projection is often a psychological defense mechanism that we would see here. And it's where a person subconsciously assigns their undesirable feelings to another person. Here's where a lot of our inherent bias about blindness will come out. And we don't even know we have it, but we're going to feel it and we're going to assign it to other people. You know, I'm not blind. I'm not like those other people. Stage 5, which is reintegration. And here's where your client acknowledges the permanence of their vision loss. They sort of reconcile to, okay, here's where I am. You know, that's Brad. Okay, here's where I am. So what am I going to do? Oh, I just got to learn to do things differently. And once a person hits there, they're ready to reintegrate. It's also at this point where they recognize that there's been a change in how they feel about themselves. You will recognize that likely before they do. And here's where you often start seeing clients refer to themselves as blind, or at least being able to use the word blind, where maybe 6 months earlier, they didn't even want you to use that word. And they start to see blindness as just another part of themselves. And here's where you start to hear the I can or I will. Yeah, I'll do that. Or yeah, I think I can do that. I can try that. And when you start to see those words popping up on a regular basis, you know that you have moved. Because think about it. I'm not saying I don't need you. Now I can't do that. I won't do that. Now I'm like, yeah, I can try that. Yeah, I'll try that. So again, as a person hits this stage and progresses through it, their attitude will get more and more positive. So here's the danger hook for us though. When a person's there, we say, wow, great, they're gonna do great from this point on, and we're on easy street now, until the next time you come back and they move back into a previous stage where they're hostile and angry, or they're back denying again. But over time, that that jumping back to those previous stages won't happen as often, and it won't last as long. There's a physical education book that Dr. Ponchilla and Dr. Lieberman wrote a number of years ago that has a whole chapter on Livna's unified model of adjustment. It's excellent. And there's a whole table there that you can look at that goes into a lot more detail than we did. And then another one is chapter 2 in the new Foundations of Vision Rehabilitation Therapy textbook. That does the same thing because Ponchilla wrote a lot of that. And he has that same table in there, but he also does a much deeper dive in inherent bias and the prejudice against blindness of people out in the community.